The Insights Idaho Department of Finance communicates department news and perspectives to aid consumers in making educated financial decisions and to inform both industry and consumers of regulatory and consumer protection issues.
Hello, welcome to the 10th episode of Insights. I'm Celia Kenny, Consumer Affairs Program Coordinator.
And I'm Kelly Davis, Program Specialist with the Idaho Department of Finance. Today, we will talk about an emerging scam known as pig butchering. To share their perspectives on this increasingly prevalent scam, we are excited to have Securities Bureau Chief John Yaros and Joe Saar from Chainalysis join us.
Joe Saar is a solutions architect and training specialist with Chainalysis, a blockchain data and investigations platform. Thank you for joining us, Joe. We look forward to your perspective and appreciate your willingness to contribute to this important conversation. With that, I'll transition to you, John.
Thanks, Celia, and thanks for joining us today, Joe. You really possess a terrific background, and your role at Chainalysis makes you well-positioned to walk us through the growing threat of pig butchering scams. However, to start, I would love for you to tell us about your career journey, and it would be great if you could explain to the audience what your company Chainalysis is and does.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so. And thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be a part of this. So my name is Joe Saar. I'm a solutions architect here at Chainalysis. I've been here about a little over 2 years now. My background professionally, got my start as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. So I did 4 years assigned out in Southern California. After I got out of active duty, I went to local law enforcement in Orange County in SoCal. Started off working patrol services. And then I was fortunate enough to get a spot in our special investigations unit as a detective. So I started out there working like street level narcotics. Then we got into major narcotics and I got into human trafficking. So I was working that a lot. And it was really, really exciting. The cases were really great. And then around 2017, I attended an executive MBA program at USC. And that's where I got exposed to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. That was the first time I'd seen the Coinbase app. And you couldn't be on a business school campus without like talking about crypto at that time. And so me and my friends, like we got into it. We were super excited about it. And then I was like, hey, there's probably a lot of criminal activity that can be occurring like using this. So I went back to my boss at SIU. And I was like, hey, we should be looking into this. And he was like, I don't know about that. That sounds kind of fishy to me. He's like, why don't you stick to what we know? And I'm like, all right, roger that, sir. I got it. And then a short period of time after that, we ended up having a big case that we worked with DEA regarding a darknet vendor that was selling fentanyl. They were importing it from China and distributing it locally, pressing it into pills, and then and selling it through the mail throughout the U.S. So that led to a pretty large takedown and seizure. And after that, I think my boss was like, okay, that was the proof of concept that we needed, Joe. Why don't you go forth and conquer now? So from there, I started working with pretty much every federal agency because there weren't a ton of cops at that time on the West Coast that really knew anything about crypto. And I would include myself in that as well. And so when we started working, we were kind of like learning as we went. It was like really good on the job training. And so we were working a lot of darknet cases, a lot of targeting vendors, doing a lot of money laundering cases, like undercover operations. And before too long, like I was taking over, darknet vendor accounts, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing. So those were fun learning experiences for sure. So ultimately, I got assigned to an FBI high-tech crimes task force. I was working there with them a lot. And then I got rotated to our crimes against persons unit, and then ultimately came to Chain. So I get a little bit of the law enforcement side working with the agencies here in SoCal. So I kind of got the best of both worlds there. So interesting background that, led me to Chain. And now at Chain, what our company does is we're a blockchain data platform. So initially, Chainalysis started way back in 2014. I say way back, but that's way back in terms of crypto years, as a response to like the Silk Road darknet market case. And so our co-founders started on that. They started working that, and they were supporting U.S. law enforcement in that investigation. And that led to the creation of this company. So now what Chainalysis does is we're much larger these days. We're much more, we're global. So we provide investigative solutions. We also provide compliance solutions. And we have a number of different tools, resources, and also personnel like investigators that support that. So basically, we're following the money. We're identifying who's who on the blockchain, and we're helping agencies catch bad guys and recover funds for victims.
Yeah, that's a great background, Joe. And I have to say, every year in crypto is like a decade in real life, is always what I try to tell people. And I have to say that I really appreciate Chainalysis' mission, and I'm thankful that they're a partner in this fight against crypto scams and pig butchering specifically. But with that said, I'd like to transition into our topic today, pig butchering. As you know, investment scams are the number one form of cybercrime, according to the FBI. Investment scams accounted for over $4.5 billion in losses last year in the United States. And that's just what was reported, right? And nearly $4 billion of those losses reference crypto in some way. And many are likely pig butchering schemes. So this is an extremely important topic. I usually describe pig butchering as a long-term scam that really combines elements of traditional investment schemes, romance, friendship, or social scams, and cryptocurrency transactions. However, I would love to hear your thoughts. So can you explain what pig butchering scams are, their origin, and how this scam differs from other types of financial and cybercrime?
Yeah, great question. So for starters, pig butchering scams are different than typical financial scams because they're much more targeted at a particular individual, and they're targeting something different in the other ones. They're targeting human emotion. And so one of the ways that like it kind of reminds me of human trafficking investigations that I used to work, because we had these people called Romeo pimps. And what they would do is they would target young girls coming out of group homes that unfortunately were sexually abused, things like that. And they were able to prey on them that way. And so pig butchering functions in a similar manner. The target profile is a little bit different, or the victim profile is a little bit different. So a lot of times what they're looking for is people that are on dating apps, people that are maybe have just got out of a divorce or a serious relationship issue, people that are maybe down on their luck, or that they haven't had any support from family and stuff like that. So they're pulling on their heartstrings. And like you said, it is a very, very long game. So sometimes you'll see these scams, they can play out over the course of months and months and months, because what the scammers are doing is they'll reach out with a cold text or a cold call, and it could be on WhatsApp, it could be on Facebook Messenger, or very, very commonly, it's on a dating app. It could be on Hinge, it could be on Tinder, Bumble, things like that. And so they'll reach out, and of course, they're impersonating somebody else, but they'll try to build a relationship with the victim, and they won't like go right into like, hey, invest in my cryptocurrency scheme here. They're going to get to that at some point, but first they need to build that foundation, that good relationship, to show that they're trustworthy and that they care about them, that they're interested in their family and their background and things like that. And after they get the victim kind of interested and hooked on that, the scammer will then inject the cryptocurrency scheme essentially, and they're saying, hey, I've made millions of dollars on this investment platform, and I can teach you how to use it if you're interested. And then they'll leave it there, and then after they continue developing this relationship, they'll go at it a little bit harder. And now the victim trusts this person. They've been talking to them for a while. They know about each other's families. Of course, the scammer's family is totally made up, and that's when the victim will start to bite on this. And so what the scammers will do oftentimes is they may rig up a scam website. And sometimes this website will look, or it'll have a similar name to a legitimate cryptocurrency service or a legitimate cryptocurrency exchange. And so when the victim goes and does a quick Google search to get some background on it, what they often find are all the Google search hits for that legitimate service. And so they like, hey, it's all good here. And so, of course, now the victim doesn't realize that they're being pulled into this scam. And the scammers will say, hey, here's the crypto addresses. What you need to do is send funds to it. And they'll walk them through that process. And so now once the victim invests, what they're seeing on the scam website interface is it appears that they're generating these really outrageous returns. And so because of that, they'll go in more. They'll deposit more money. So an interesting number that Chainalysis tracks is the average victim deposit going into one of these scams is about $4,600. Now that's the average deposit. The average loss is significantly higher, well over $100,000 for each victim here, because the victim keeps going in because they think they're like, hey, this is really, really amazing. I'm getting these awesome returns. And the app shows that that's what's happening. Meanwhile, unfortunately, the victims don't know any better. If they did, they can look up the transactions. They can look at things like block explorers, and they could see that, hey, your money's just moving from one address to another. Mm-hmm. There's actually no ROI being generated whatsoever. If they knew that, they would be able to stop this in its tracks, but unfortunately, they don't. And by the time they catch on, when they try to potentially withdraw funds out of the service, they're hit with hey, because of money laundering guidelines, we can't do that. You need 60 to 90 days. Or an even better one is, in order to do this, you need to pay your capital gains tax. And so they'll hit them with another fee in order to withdraw the funds. And meanwhile, the victim just gets hit again there, and they're pretty much out of money at this point. And when they realize they can't withdraw anything, that's the end of the scam. Essentially, they realize that they've been scammed. And this whole process could have occurred over the course of months and months and months. And now the victim's left with nothing. They realize that they've been scammed, and there's a whole number of consequences that come from that, obviously. So that's a long story long, I think, on how these scams might work.
Well, yeah, no, but that's a great background, Joe, right there, and giving us that key information on it. It really shows you how they really fatten up their targets. Their goal is to get them for everything that they're worth at the end of the day. So this really long-term view that they take is very unique in these scams. Now, many people, and I think this is something really important to point out, say, I would never fall for a scam like that. They think people must be dumb, ignorant, or careless. And that's just not the case at all. I've had Harvard lawyers, I've had sophisticated people in investments fall for this. Can you explain the types of victims that this happens to? And I just want to take away really that shame from victims and thinking, hey, I don't want to tell anybody about this because I'm embarrassed, or this idea of overconfidence or hubris that, hey, I'm never going to get hit by this type of scam in my life.
Yeah. And I think that's, I would never fall victim to this, is, a common misconception. Because when you look at all the facts of the case afterwards, after it comes out, you're like, man, how could anybody fall for this? But it's very believable, because what ends up happening is, as I said before, the victims are looking for something. They're looking for love or companionship or something like that, or potentially just investment opportunities or friendship or things like that. And so they're playing on that really real human emotion. And so, Alona Katz, she's from the Brooklyn DA's office, outstanding prosecutor, and her office works a lot of these cases. Her approach to it is, when they get one of these reports, the first thing she says is, I'm sorry this happened to you, and we're here to help you, and this could happen to anybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it's that human emotion that they're playing on. And if you look at some of the stats, the people that are falling victim to it are more educated people, right? A higher educated, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and things like that. Typically in the age range from 30 up until elderly.
Yep.
I mean, the elderly scams are even more insidious in some ways, because some of these people are living paycheck to paycheck, and they're spending their Social Security funds on these things, and they lose everything. And what's the recourse for them? So realistically, it could be anyone. And I'll say this as an interesting one. I believe it was in the Washington Post. They had a headline, how an ex-cop fell for a $66 million cryptocurrency scam. I believe that was the amount.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I was like, man, what agency does this guy work for? Because I'm going to apply there, 66 million. But obviously, I'm making a little bit of gallows humor there. But he was just one part of this much, much larger scam that accumulated to 66 million. So again, it's affecting people all over the country in every single state. If you look at IC3 data, which is Internet Crimes Complaint Center, they categorize all these by confidence romance scams, and they list the amount of complaints and the dollar loss per state. And it's very, very high, and it's only increasing as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think something else to really point out here is how sophisticated these scripts are. These are written out, they're well researched, and there's a lot of social engineering that occurs. So I think for our audience, giving them a little understanding of what social engineering is and how everything they have out there on the internet about themselves in any way, shape, or form can be used to kind of create these scripts that people can target them.
Yeah, absolutely. So social engineering essentially is a way for anyone to gather information that's publicly available about a target of interest. Now, I say that law enforcement does that when we're looking at a suspect. I've solved a number of cases just by what information was publicly put out there on things like Instagram, or adding somebody on their Snapchat or on their Facebook accounts and things like that. So criminals do the same exact thing. They're profiling their target, and they want to get as much information as humanly possible about them. Now, some information is going to be out there no matter what. Like, if you purchased a house, that might be information that's on the internet. But if you have an open Instagram account and you're posting all of your pictures and your license plates in the background, or your house addresses in the background, or your phone, things like that, people don't realize how much information they're putting out there about themselves. And so, I used to be a lot more cautious about this. Now I have a LinkedIn account, unfortunately, but there's tons of information that can be gathered about the victims. And that's what these scammers are using. And what you said about a script, a playbook, that's exactly what they have. And there was a Reddit post a couple of years ago where it was outlining all the steps on conducting one of these scams. So it's pretty crazy. It was written in Chinese, it was translated, but it's literally a play-by-play on how to conduct these. And once you've burned out, once you've killed that pig, and once you've butchered that pig, you move on to the next one. And so oftentimes what you'll see is these scammers, they just spin up another scam. They just keep going, they keep rolling. And unfortunately for the victims, after they've been victimized here, throughout the process of reporting it, they can end up feeling victimized again because of the shame and embarrassment that comes along with it. And people always will say, like, I can't believe I fell for this. This will always be something that they'll say. But really, it's anybody can fall for it. And we need to be careful out there.
No, I'm happy you brought up that playbook because this kind of spins into something that I also want to talk about, which is red flags that our audience should be aware of to protect themselves from pig butchering scams. These scams are very methodical, and they have some very identifiable steps that the public can recognize to help prevent themselves from becoming victims. So can you please share what some of those red flags are that they can see and be able to identify, whether they're in a scam, being targeted for a scam, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So depending on the platform, like how you're reached out to, like there's some cases where you can get a cold text out of nowhere. And it'll say something random like, "Hey, Barbara, sorry, I'm running late for the golf course, today," or something like that. If you get a random text out of the blue, it's not good. Just don't even respond. But if you're on a dating app, you're looking for something, right? You're looking for some type of relationship. And so that's where these scammers will, oftentimes like congregate. And so obviously you want to look at basic things like, what does the profile look like? Are there any recent photos? Are there videos? Can you talk to this person? Sometimes, and I think with AI, this is going to be changing here, but sometimes you'll see, their English won't be, or they won't be writing things the way somebody who is a native English speaker might be speaking. So if you see that, obviously, one way around that, they're going to say that they're from country X, Y, Z or something like that. But that's something else to look out for. Now, if they start talking about investments and things like that, that's an immediate red flag immediately. And if it sounds too good to be true, it almost always is. So I would always be very, very cautious. If you haven't met somebody in person, like if at a bare minimum, if you don't know that they are a true person that actually exists, I would not send them anything. I probably wouldn't continue talking to them because, that's a great way for you to fall into one of these scams. Now, when they start talking about these investment platforms, they might give a website or something like that to talk about. What you can do, obviously, you can Google search it, but you can look at the domain name. So this is something we would do more on the law enforcement side, but people can do this too. Individual people can do this, and they can look up where the domain's hosted, where the IP address it originates from, when it was stood up. Things like that are going to be important for them to look at, because that's one way they could say, well, you said that you've been involved in this, cryptocurrency mining business for 2 years, but it says that this website was started 2 months ago. So what's going on there? Like little things like that. Of course, that gets a little bit more technical, but I think at a very basic level, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and I would walk away from it.
No, that's great, Joe, and great advice. Something else that I also just want to touch on quickly is the use of legitimate crypto exchanges such as Coinbase or Kraken, kind of how that lures people into thinking that they're a part of something legitimate before they move them onto a platform that is kind of owned and operated by the scammers. Can you go into kind of that and how that builds a level of confidence in what's happening?
Yeah. So obviously, the exchanges you mentioned are the legitimate US-based exchanges, and they have law enforcement teams, they have compliance teams. And I can tell you right now, from working with them, they don't want any of this on their platform at all. So they want to target it, and they don't want their customers being victimized either. So they're very proactive about working with law enforcement. However, they need to be alerted to it in some way or another. So what you could see is the scammer will mention something about using Coinbase and how Coinbase is a legitimate platform. And at this point, people in the United States, almost everybody has heard of Coinbase. Doesn't matter if you're involved in crypto or not. And so there's that feeling of legitimacy there. But there are crypto exchanges that have like non-custodial wallets. So when the scammer might tell the victim to download one of these non-custodial wallets that's launched by this service, but the service doesn't actually have oversight. They're not in control of the funds there. It was really like a private wallet for that individual person. And so the victim thinks that they're actually interacting with this legitimate service that has all these oversight capabilities, but what they're using is a private wallet that they really don't have too much oversight on. So that's another way that they might fall victim to this. Now, what scammers are going to do, and realistically, like any type of criminal, at some point they need to liquidate their funds. They need to cash out. So they can try to use one of these services. Now, of course, if you're a US-based exchange, they're in compliance with FinCEN guidelines and things like that. So they're going to file CTRs, they're going to file SARs, they're going to be looking at this from a compliance perspective. Hey, where did these funds originate from? So you could see scammers that are trying to open up fraudulent accounts with fraudulent credentials that they got from another victim. So exchanges and these services are always going to play a role. For law enforcement, if we're investigating these, that I like to see that because I know that that's a location that I could get more information for my investigation, like steps that I can take to take action in tracing down this lead and hopefully returning some of the victim's funds.
No, thanks for that information. I kind of want to move on now to really discuss the geographic footprint and types of bad actors that are carrying out these scams. I often think it's really difficult for people at the local level to comprehend the global nature of these crimes. Could you please share with our listeners really the main geographic locations where pig butchering scammers operate and why the governments of those countries don't really crack down on this activity?
Yeah, so this is a pretty heavy one because a lot of these scams will originate out of Southeast Asia. And there's a number of countries out there that they'll actually have call centers where these scammers are based out of. Now, unfortunately, from what it looks like from information that's been gathered and reports that have been written, it looks like some of the scammers are actually victims of some form of human trafficking themselves. So they're essentially being forced into running these scams and they can't leave the compound. And so they're not only are the scammers are essentially victims themselves in some of these cases. And there's these criminal organizations that are actually operating them. So oftentimes, they'll be based out of that location. However, that doesn't preclude involvement from people in the US. And I'll give a couple of quick examples here. In December, the FBI, it was announced that they indicted a number of individuals out of the Central District of California that were involved in laundering money for this operation. And these people were based in the US. So you will see some US involvement or some criminal involvement here in the United States. Another interesting one that I was just reading about was there was a bank in Kansas last year where the CEO, who was a large stakeholder in the company and shareholder.
I remember this one. Yeah.
This was crazy. So he actually fell victim to one of these scams, but then he was embezzling funds from the bank to go into these schemes. And that caused the bank to become insolvent. And so the bank failed because of this. So again, it's like multiple layers of, victimization here. And now you have a victim that's also embezzling funds. So even though they're based out of Southeast Asia, the victims obviously are largely going to be based here, but there could still be suspects or people that are a part of it in some way, shape, or form locally as well.
Yeah. And I think giving our listeners an understanding of the organized crime groups or what types of bad actors are there, essentially, I don't think they recognize how well organized these groups are, their scale, and how they've really industrialized their operations to support these scams specifically for pig butchering. Could you kind of go into kind of the scale and just so people could understand how well organized this is?
Yeah. So as I was saying before with the manual, the pig butchering manual that was published, they really take a step-by-step guide to running one of these operations. So you could have a location that has tens or maybe 100 people that are working on one of these. And there's different phases or different pieces of this organization. So you could have the person that's actually initiating the text messages or that's talking to the victim. But then you're going to have the people that are the tech savvy people that are spinning up these scam websites. You're going to have people that are laundering the money, people that are getting fraudulent credentials so that they can open up fake accounts so that they can liquidate. So there's a lot of different pieces to this, and they all need to be working together in order for them to function effectively. Now, once one scam gets identified, the victim realizes, oh my God, I've been scammed here. I've lost everything. What do the scammers do? Well, they just shut down and they spin up another one. So if we're looking at some of them on chain, like looking at on the blockchain, sometimes what you'll see is connections between one scam that's going to another one. That's what's great about the chain with Reactor, with our investigative solutions, is that you can see those connections. You can also see that the same person that's the initial funder of a certain cryptocurrency address has also funded other ones that are connected to different scams. So very quickly, for law enforcement, you might get one of these
Yeah.
reports and you might say like, okay, this person lost $30,000, which is like an astronomical loss for them. But, is that going to rise to the level of, investigating this like at a federal level? Like, is there something that we can do here more? But then when you look at the transactions on chain, you realize that your victim in your, immediate location lost 30K, but there's a ton of money coming from other sources, from other scams that are consolidated here. So I have one example that I talk to law enforcement a lot. I'm like, yeah, this victim lost 2 million, but if we actually look at the overall scam picture, if we build this out, we can see that there's been closer to 20 million that's gone into this. So we have other victims out there from other scams that, we haven't identified yet. So that's why the on-chain data is going to be super, super important when we're conducting one of these investigations.
Yeah, no, and I think these are really great points, because I think a lot of times the victims look at it and they see just the picture from their online dating profile of this person or what they see on WhatsApp of them. And there's this idea that, hey, this is just the one person that's kind of taking advantage of me, without recognizing that that's just the tip of the pyramid. It goes really deep and really wide and is really well structured. Now I want to transition into something that I think is really important to me and all those really attempting to protect the public from pig butchering scam. And that's the challenge that regulators and law enforcement agencies face when investigating these scams, specifically the resource and collaboration challenges we face. You discussed a little bit of the need for transaction analysis tools, and I'm not sure that policymakers, government entities, or the public truly understand why we need tools like transaction tracing tools. As I mentioned earlier, investment fraud is the #1 form of cybercrime. And we can't help the public if we don't invest in and have access to the tools that enable us to protect the public from these scams. So can you talk about the importance of these tools, and for everybody from policymakers to the public understanding the importance of tools like Chainalysis?
Yeah, let me just go back to one of your initial points really quick, was the challenges that law enforcement face. So when one of these scams goes through, it could be months before the victim realizes what has actually happened. So we're talking about, by the time that they report it to law enforcement's already significantly behind on the movement of funds there. And that's if the victim actually does report it, because there is that sense of shame or embarrassment, and they might not. So the number that we are looking at for like the amount of reported scams that have happened relating to pig butchering is significantly underreported, because we have that issue. So then when law enforcement gets it, oftentimes they're not equipped to deal with it. They might not understand, because it sounds like a new thing, and it's like, hey, is this even a crime? Well, of course it is. And part of it is, law enforcement, and I was absolutely guilty of this. You come out of the academy, you're working patrol services, like you learned a billion different things, and then you're trying to remember everything that you have to do and what steps you have to take and what crimes are which. And then you're faced with something that's new, you've never heard of before, and you don't know how to work it. So the first thing is like, yes, take the report, right? We have to do that. And then we can start working from there. So we can start looking up like, hey, what's actually happening on chain? Now, the importance of the tracing tools like Chainalysis, like Reactor, is that, one, we're looking at the big picture. So in a regular, like most blockchains, when we're talking about cryptocurrencies specifically, are public. So you can look at transactions on a block explorer like mempool.space or Etherscan or something like that. But you're not getting a lot of the attribution data that's associated, or in some cases, you're not getting any attribution data out of like who's who on the chain. So that's what Chainalysis does. We're identifying, hey, who are these different entities are? Is this an exchange? Is this a darknet market? Is this a scammer? So on and so forth. So by identifying these, hey, what are the cash out points? What are the suspects actually doing with the money? And you can visualize it a lot better, and you can map it out. I mean, the first time I saw Reactor, I said, why didn't we have this before? I was doing all this tracing manually. It was taking me hours, and something that took me 5 minutes within Reactor to actually trace out. So those things are huge, but also the connections, as I mentioned before, to other known scams, right? Being able to track and understand like, hey, it probably isn't just this victim based out of, Southern California, but there's probably other victims based all over the United States that are sending funds into the scam. So very quickly, you can deal with something that you initially thought was, a $10,000 or $30,000 loss, but actually it's, up in the millions. And now this would ultimately lead to more resources for conducting this investigation. So those are some of the reasons that tracing tools are going to be are important now, but they're going to be increasingly important as we see, like, this year over year scam revenue, it continues to increase.
Now, you lead training at Chainalysis as well, and the digital asset space is kind of always evolving, right? It's constantly moving. There's constantly new schemes and scams. And this also means that law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and others need to keep up with their training just to be able to counteract these types of threats. Can you go into a little bit of depth into that as well, and kind of the training you do, and also why this is so vital for those trying to fight pig butchering scams?
Yeah, absolutely. So, previously I was specifically on our training team, which was a lot of fun because most of the time I was talking to, law enforcement, or I was talking to investigators at exchanges, and we're talking about, like, hey, how do these scams work? What's actually happening, like, on chain, and how do we investigate it? So the idea was taking, especially law enforcement, taking them from 0 to 1, right? Because what you'll see is, initially you don't know what you don't know, and
Yep.
you're going to look right past it. You're going to walk right by it. And so that's what we didn't want law enforcement to do, right? We want them to at least recognize it, that it's there. And a quick example was a few weeks ago, I was in Central California. I was giving a law enforcement briefing to one of the HIDAs out there. And then I got a call last week.
And just for those who don't know, HIDA is high intensity drug trafficking area.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
I should have said
Yeah.
that. I got a call last week from an agency. They were like, hey, we took your class and we knew what to look for. We found these seed phrases. We found this crypto app on this guy's phone, and he's a major narcotics trafficker. They arrested him with, like, I think 6 pounds. And they were like, yeah, well, what do we do next? And I'm like, okay, perfect. This is great because you at least knew what to look for, right? So that's the start, right? That's the start. So within Chainalysis, we have our academy, which is academy.chainalysis.com. And I'll send you the links for this later.
Right.
But we have a bunch of free training on there, some just basics, like what to look for, crypto fundamentals, and things like that. We also have, the ad hoc trainings that I'll do with law enforcement. We also have certifications specifically for conducting these investigations and using, blockchain analytics tools like Reactor. So what you need to, how to identify who's who on chain, how to conduct change address analysis, like understanding different heuristics for, like, clustering things together. Those are all going to be important things that law enforcement needs to know. And especially as, crypto's the currency of the internet at this point. And, we're seeing it now. Wait for 10 years from now, when the kids that grew up with this stuff, really grew up with this, are going to be coming into their own. And unfortunately, some of them we know are going to go into criminal activity, and this is what they're going to be using.
Yeah, an unfortunate reality, but just the truth, right? As things evolve, so does crime evolve. In addition to kind of tools and training, I think we can all agree that pig butchering scams really rely a lot on jurisdictional arbitrage due to really the global nature of the crime. Often state and local actors, such as the Idaho Department of Finance, are on the front lines of the battle against pig butchering, but this crime really requires an all-hands-on-deck approach. So can you describe the importance of collaboration between local, regional, national, and global stakeholders in the fight against pig butchering?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably one of the best examples of this is the REACT task force in Northern California under Santa Clara. They've honed this down to a science. So they have a task force of locals, and they're cross sworn federally. They're task force officers. In fact, like, years ago, they were the ones that taught me about, like, SIM swapping. Like, I didn't know anything about it. So I've been learning from them for years, and they set a really good example for everyone else out there. So I think when we're looking at these investigations, it really, really starts with locals, because they're going to be the ones that the victims come to first. They're going to come into the local PD, or they're going to make a telephonic report about, a fraud incident or a hacking thing or something like that. And the patrol officers are going to go out there and take that report. From there, where does it go? If it goes anywhere. So I think agencies are getting much, much better about this, because they're realizing, hey, this is a commonly occurring thing now. So from there, what I would encourage victims to do is file this report through IC3, the Internet Crimes Complaint Center, because that's the federal database where, this is a global database, but it's run by the FBI. This is a good aggregator for these types of scams, because then, there's one location where, addresses or specific scam names can be searched. So that alone right there is, a partnership between locals and federal agencies. Now, again, if we're seeing, a victim in Los Angeles, there could be a number of different victims all over the country. And just because we're seeing that, the scammers might be based physically out of Southeast Asia, that doesn't preclude us from conducting this investigation and potentially returning funds to our victims, making our victims whole or getting victim restitution. And Erin West, she's the prosecutor at the REACT Task Force. She gave an example that I really liked. And she was talking about how, like, if, we were investigating stolen bicycles and we recovered them, we would apply for a warrant and apply to the judge and say, hey, we want to recover these stolen bicycles and return them to the victims. And that's something that absolutely any law enforcement agency would do. So the same approach should be taken when we're thinking about cryptocurrency, because it still is an asset. It's still, if there's an opportunity to recover it and make our victims whole, we should be pursuing that. Now, that's really important, because if we get to the point where, and this is going to be realistically, this is an uphill battle, because it requires education of the public to not fall for these scams. It requires education of law enforcement so that they can identify when these scams are occurring and what are the next steps. But we need to think about this from the terms of, basically, what are we going to do and how are we going to recover the funds to shut these operations down? Because if we take the money out of it, that's what's going to cause them to shut down shop and move on. So even if we can't go put handcuffs on somebody that's based out of Cambodia, and I'll make the same statement here on this podcast that I do to every law enforcement agency. If anybody's going out to Cambodia, put handcuffs on people, let me know, because I would love to join you. I would love to be a part of that, based on the amount of pig butchering scams that we see here. But if we can't do that, if we can at least get the money back or take the financial incentive away from the scammers, that's a win there. And so we should pursue that with any opportunity that we can. So local and federal law enforcement partnerships, especially with private sector partnerships as well, are going to be crucial in combating this going forward.
Yeah, and I want to tell kind of all the listeners on this podcast that the Idaho Department of Finance, I know I'm building out a financial crimes and intelligence unit here. The goal is report it to the Idaho Department of Finance Securities Bureau. We are going to help you. We're going to help you get with IC3. We're going to help you get with the locals and everything else. We're looking to facilitate that. So first thing for those in Idaho, get it to me, get it to my team at the Idaho Department of Finance, and like I said, and get it to all the others, your local police, IC3 with the FBI, so that we can all work in that all hands on deck manner to get you the resolution that you're looking for. Changing gears a little bit here, can you share with our listeners really kind of the role that Bitcoin or crypto ATMs play in enabling pig butchering scams? And what needs to happen from a regulatory and AML or anti-money laundering perspective to better protect the public from these types of scams? I would be interested in your thoughts there, Joe.
Yeah. So for those that are not aware, a crypto ATM functions a lot like a regular ATM that you're used to seeing it. But they'll be located, they could be in like a tobacco shop, a liquor store, they could be in a 7-Eleven, they can be in any type of store like that, or sometimes they could be in large grocery stores. So effectively what you do with them is you go in, you put cash in, and then you tell the ATM where you want the funds to go. So oftentimes it'll be like on a crypto wallet that's on your phone. There might be a QR code. So what the scammers will do, and this is not unique to pig butchering, this could be a number of different scams, especially with things like extortion, sextortion, things like that. They'll walk the victim through how to go to one of these ATMs, and they're located all throughout the United States and throughout the world. We can look them up, the locations of them on like Coin ATM Radar, tons of them out there. And so they'll walk the victim through how to go to an ATM and how to deposit funds in, and they'll tell them specifically where to have the funds sent. So a lot of times they're used in these scams, especially targeting elderly, especially with the impersonation type scams. So now one thing to note, in the United States, every crypto ATM company is required to be registered as an MSB, a money services business. What does that mean? Well, that means that they're required to be registered with FinCEN. So therefore, they need to file currency transaction reports. They need to file suspicious activity reports. So they should be doing that when they're seeing any type of suspicious activity occurring on their platform. Likewise, this is an opportunity for law enforcement because we can contact those services and get information about the underlying transaction data or who else might be using that platform. Again, that's not unique to pig butchering. So as far as ATMs go, they're very, very commonly used in just about every type of scam. So again, we need to bring awareness to not just law enforcement about what they are, where they are, and how they function, but also to victims to know, like, hey, if someone's telling you to go to a crypto ATM, they're probably not somebody you want to talk to very much further.
Yeah, and that's one of those pillars we always say during our senior financial fraud and exploitation roadshow and other educational things that we do. If somebody's asking you to pay with an alternative payment method, a lot of times there's a reason for it, and it's usually not a good reason. So that should put up an alarm bell over your head and just say, hey, slow down, take a breath, and this probably may not be the best idea. So I think that that's very wise and very helpful. Well, I know we've covered a lot today, and I've really enjoyed the conversation, but I want to finish our time by really focusing on what can be done to prevent our audience from becoming victims of pig butchering. And I also want our listeners to be aware of how to respond if they believe they are potentially the target or victim of one of these scams. So what can individuals, regulators, law enforcement, policymakers, and everything else in between potentially be doing better to hopefully counteract pig butchering scams and operations?
Yeah, so it really starts with education, understanding what's out there, how crypto works, and I always tell law enforcement agencies, you guys don't need to know what every single crypto does, what every single blockchain does. Like, quite frankly, it doesn't matter. What we need to know is just when it's there, when it's involved, because then we can figure out what the next steps to take are. So education is going to be super, super important, and that's just not just educating detectives and the analysts and stuff like that, but even our patrol officers, because they're the ones that are on the front lines that are going to be taking these reports, that are going to be fielding them, and then they're going to go to the detective bureau at some point from there. So with any of these types of cases, there needs to be an emphasis on speed, because typically when it's reported, we're already very, very, very behind the eight ball.
Yep.
So when patrol receives one of these reports, it needs to get fast tracked really to the like an investigator at the detective bureau, so that they can start working it and they can start reaching out to the powers that be and who else they might need support from. So education, again, from all levels, is going to be super important. And also, as law enforcement learns about this, we need to be taking steps to educate the public about it. So, every year we would do a citizens academy, and I would teach that, and I'd be like, hey, here's the things to look out for. Here's the cyber threats and stuff like that. Anything that's like the REACT Task Force, again, does a fantastic job with educating law enforcement and the public about this. But every agency really needs to be proactive about it, because if victims realize, hey, their spidey senses start tingling, and they're like, this sounds like a scam. I remember that nerd Joe talking about this. If they see that, then, hey, there's no money going from that victim to the scammer, right? We just lost that scam some money. Ultimately, the best case scenario is cut it off before it starts.
Yep.
But if we can't, and it already happens, then we need to move quickly. And we need, in order to do that, we need to be educated on what the steps are.
Yeah, I know something else we're looking to do just on our end is maintain a database, to the wallet, so that we can identify what are people who are victims within the state, and so that they can lay claim on that in the future, because seizures do happen. Bad guys keep doing bad things, as I like to say, and eventually they're going to stub their toe somewhere. And when we do have seizures and successes, which do happen, we want to make sure that our people at the local level know that they have claim on what's in a certain wallet, so that we can help them get that back. And this is just going to kind of build on a point that you had earlier, but I do think it's worth repeating again, is that criminals depend on delayed reporting or personal embarrassment that deters reporting to ensure the success of their scams. They are hoping that you feel that way, because, again, as you said, Joe, it puts them further and further behind the eight ball, law enforcement and regulators and everybody else. So again, please report it as soon as possible. Even if you think you may be the victim, report it to me and my team ASAP. Report it to law enforcement. Report it to the FBI. Let's get it out there, because again, that is key to the success of these types of scams. Now, another thing that I want to touch on briefly, before we go, is you have the pig butchering scams, but recently what we've been seeing emerging, and we've been getting a lot of calls on this, is re-victimization schemes. Essentially, there are third-party entities claiming that they can help victims trace and retrieve funds from crypto scams, when in reality, they're just looking to extract more money from victims. Can you discuss how these operations work and what our audience should know about who actually possesses the capabilities and authorities to assist the public with tracing and potential seizures?
Yeah, this is a great point. And so again, preying on that victim, that re-victimization, like this happens so often, unfortunately. And what people need to understand is the only people that can recover funds, that can seize funds, freeze funds, or anything like that, is law enforcement. They're the only ones that can do that. So if anyone's reaching out to you and saying, hey, I can get your funds back or something like that, be very, very cautious, because realistically, they cannot. There might be companies out there that can do some tracing, that can help out, maybe, but I'm very suspect of anyone that's offering that. So I would always encourage the whoever it is, the victim, to reach out to law enforcement and say like, hey, this is what's happening, or I was contacted by these people.
Yep.
But again, if it's not law enforcement, they cannot seize or recover funds. So paying money out to them might just ultimately end up losing you more money. So be very, very cautious.
No, that's great advice again, Joe, and thanks for touching on that. So I have two questions left, and the first one really focuses on the emotional toll of pig butchering crimes. Victims lose not only money, but also these deep emotional relationships in this long-term con. And this is emotionally devastating for them, right? Can you share with us some things you believe can be done to help victims handle the emotional devastation that they're going to face, or resources that they should be aware of to help them handle the emotional blowback from this type of scam?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't actually know fully how to answer this one. I would say I'm thinking like therapy type things, but
Yeah.
in terms of specifically, talking to you like right now.
Yeah,
um,
I would say, just from my perch, just to get in it, I would say that a lot of this too is just treat it like any other type of perhaps mental crisis that you're happening. Don't be scared to reach out for help and to talk about this. It may have a very specific thing that you've been involved in, a pig butchering or investment scam, but I think it's important that if you need to reach out to mental health professionals and other things, because there is a lot. There is the loss of the relationship. There is this loss of money. There is this, where am I now in my life, scariness that kind of takes over. So I think that that's something important for us to develop out as well for incident response as we move ahead. And, this is me just thinking out loud, right? And I think that's important for us as a community. That's why we hold these things, right, and talk together. But I think that it's just something that we should look to develop as a community. And again, that public-private partnership, getting all hands on deck, I think that this is an important thing to help people get over this so that they don't take more drastic action overall.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that, my friend. Now to close, we've talked about a lot of the horrific pieces of pig butchering, right? And I want to end on a positive note as much as we can on this. So let me ask you, what are you seeing that gives you hope that we'll be able to better neutralize the threat of pig butchering now and in the future, and other crypto-related scams?
Yeah, the thing that gives me hope is that law enforcement is catching on, not just, at the local level, but we're talking about senior stakeholders, we're talking about prosecutors, we're talking about private sector. They're all starting to come together to realize like, hey, what's the threat landscape out here and how do we combat this? And that's really going to be the only way to safeguard the American public like moving forward. And that's not unique to pig butchering. That's going to be with any type of scam. So everyone's going to need to work together. And I think the weird thing about crypto, from all of my investigations, any type of investigation I worked, but I've worked homicide, I've worked cyber, I've worked human trafficking, dope. Whenever there's crypto involved, I feel like there are more people that will drop things and help you than any other type of investigation that's out there. So anyone in law enforcement should take advantage of that. So reach out, hit me up, hit you up, like we want to help. And so it really is a team effort. And at the end of the day, our job here is to safeguard Americans. So that's what our goal is. So, and we take that seriously. So, lean on us. Like if we don't have the answers, we'll find somebody that does, and vice versa. So I think that everyone's coming around. Everybody's starting. It's like the Avengers, like coming together, to fight crime here. I think the same thing is starting to take shape. So I am encouraged to see that. We have a lot of work to do, but I think we're definitely moving in the right direction.
I think that's well said. And I think that, really building out these relationships, everybody understanding the problem, more and more conversations, and just seeing what others are doing. I just see it, more hands on deck. And just the fact that we're having this podcast now, that it's rising to that level, I think showcases that in many ways. And what I like to tell people is, about a decade ago, when I started, in the crypto space, overall, it was a very small industry, right? It was less than $10 billion or so. It was mainly just Bitcoin out there. And, it didn't really make sense for people to have the tools and other things out there, or the focus on this. And now that it's grown into a multi-trillion-dollar industry, over $1 trillion, that's changing. And now we're getting the tools, the resources, the knowledge in place that's going to give us the ability to have successes in these cases. And that's kind of of the bright spot that I see as we kind of move along. And having people like you, Joe, here just makes me happy knowing that we have such talented individuals on this. So I want to end by just thank you for a great conversation. I cannot thank you enough, Joe, for your time, insights, and partnership on this topic. And I also want to thank Chainalysis for their tremendous support in our fight to end pig butchering and other crypto-related crimes. So with that, Celia and Kelly, I'm going to pass the torch to you now to close us out.
Thank you both for joining us on this episode of Insights by IDOF. We appreciate hearing expert insights into financial scams like pig butchering and hope our listeners will now be better prepared to protect themselves against this threat. If you or someone you know has been the victim of a financial crime, we encourage you to report that. One way to do that is to visit our website, finance.idaho.gov, and select File a Complaint.
And thank you to our listeners for continuing to follow us. If you have topics you would like to submit for consideration for future episodes, please forward that feedback to our email, finance@finance.idaho.gov. For the latest information and updates from us, follow our social media accounts. Our Facebook account is @IdahoDOF, and Twitter is @IdahoFinance.
We want to thank you for joining us for our production of Insights, the Idaho Department of Finance. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about the ideas and topics that are on your mind. Forward your suggestions and feedback to our email address, finance@finance.idaho.gov.